Hello and welcome to this video that is the best kind of correct. Technically correct. That is whether or not it should be rice wine or rice beer, when talking about things like sake, soju, apong, brem, haka and more. There is something of a divide when it comes to fermented beverages made from rice. That is, those who staunchly defend it as a wine and those who make a strong case that although high in alcohol, it is grain derived and therefore a beer. This is a very solid split in the fermented rice beverage connoisseur community, if such a thing exists. There are three immediate approaches to this that really lay out the problem: the ingredients used to make rice wine, the alcohol concentration of rice wine, and the process of production. There is a difference between how sake is made and how beer is made, and you could theoretically call quits at that and say they're clearly different. And, well, yes, but that's not really a very good answer, because it doesn't tell us if it's a wine or a beer still. The major difference between the two is very simply that sake uses koji, whereas beer doesn't, although you might theoretically be able to do so. What makes koji, let's say, unique is that it's a particular kind of fungus called Aspergillus oryzae. Now, it's not just used in making sake, it's used in all sorts of other things, such as soy sauce and fermented beans, such as edamame. But the key thing here is going to be its role primarily in making sake. What it does is it converts the long starch chains in rice into, well, fermentable sugars, and therefore fermentable sugars into alcohol once you add yeast. This is a two-step process. Strictly speaking, you could say this step is the same as with beer brewing. It's basically the mashing and boiling steps, just done with a mold, not a kettle. That is also because these sugars are largely already present and fermentable, but they need to be accessed via this process of adding koji, which is essentially malting. By contrast, grapes don't have that barrier, and the glucose and fructose are really fermented by yeast. So strictly speaking, the process of creating sake is more akin to what you would have with beer. So procedurally it appears to be a beer at least. And by contrast, we have the result. A wine is nearly always well above 10% alcohol by volume. And, well, how far above will vary by a good deal, but generally speaking you start somewhere around 12% and it easily climbs higher. There is a reason why not only do they use very small cups for sake, but, well, sake is considered a wine, and it's, well, because it has a high alcohol concentration. Now, it is significantly more than beer, which is typically between 3 and 5, although it can get up to 8%. Sake is closer to 18, 25, and even sometimes up to 25% alcohol by volume. Therefore, we have a better comparison between wine, which is more than 12%, and beer, which is generally below 10%. Now, understand that sake is still considerably stronger than wine, but it is a much closer match. This, of course, brings us to the final thing: ingredients. Wine is made from grapes. This is almost an impossible hurdle to get over when talking about wine. You might more broadly be able to say just fruit juice in general, but grapes are pretty much the generally accepted and almost universally accepted requirement. On the other hand, beer is more diverse and it's made from grains. Typically, we are talking about barley, wheat, rye, and similar. Rice is, by definition, a grain, so it fits the bill, even if it is an unusual example, but there are plenty of odd grains that are used in making beer of various kinds. And so we have ingredients saying this is beer, we have a process saying this is beer, but the end product's not quite right. Strictly speaking, at least in some cases, this is why it's more complicated. That is because you can argue that some of the things we've said so far aren't 100% accurate. That is, rather than say rice wine or rice beer, it might be better to say that it's a malt liqueur. And the reason why we say malt liqueur or malt liqueur is that, well, this is a product made by taking grains and fermenting them, but always malted grains. Now, in the case of beer, this is going to be what you would call malt, which is just barley that has been malted. That word's going to get a lot of use. The key thing here is that in most, let's say, Western or non-Asian production of malted liqueur or liquor, they generally make it out of things like barley, wheat, or rye, but that doesn't mean you can't make it out of rice. And the other key thing with malt liquor is that it's typically going to be higher in alcohol than beer, and also have a much sweeter taste. Now, we don't necessarily have the sweet taste necessarily with sake, but we do definitely have the higher alcohol concentration. Now, this is where things get a little bit messy. As a general rule, you could compare the very ancient production of rice alcohols to this, but that was mostly just taking straight alcohol and turning it into something consumable. But the more modern productions do require malting. This is where that koji step comes in. A malt, at least as a liquor, in Europe, is a bit different again, as that's a relatively new thing. More so, at least in the context of beer, where adding malt rather than just adding wheat or barley as it is, wasn't as popular. Now, this was mostly as a result of the fact it added a lot of sugar that was accessible and therefore metabolizable for humans to consume. It also added alcohol content, and at the time it was very popular. Soldiers, labourers, and similar were basically living off beer. Beer in terms of higher alcohol content, beer has always been a thing in Europe to some extent. But because of this, and the fact that eventually malt liquor became a thing rather than just being malted additions to beer, we have a separation. Now, in the USA at least, you can think of malting as being not just restricted to grains you'd be familiar with. Corn is also included in that for some bizarre reason, although it's not strictly a grain. And so you now find that, at least in America, when we talk about malt liquor, we do need to look at the fact that it could match that somewhat better because it involves a malting process. The final thing here is that, well, we've looked at this purely in terms of can we take sake and put it into the square hole despite it being a very round peg? And strictly speaking, as you can see, that does work. It will give some people conniptions, but it does work. And that's the problem. Sake and similar beverages really are their own distinct beverage to some extent. And not just because, well, the process of making it is somewhat different and you can't necessarily create a one-to-one parallel, but also the ingredients really aren't used in the West at all. So for beer, you can't really say that there's anything similar. So procedurally, we don't have anything that's quite right. Ingredient-wise, we don't have a match, and as far as products go, we don't have a match either. So it is arguably better to think of it as being its own unique product, but although we should recognize it as that, it doesn't mean that it is that. This is why the closest conventional naming match to sake and similar fermented rice-based beverages is going to be beer, but it isn't a really great match. It is still better than calling it wine by a very wide margin, but it's still not a great match, which you should really be looking at it as calling it what it is exactly by its name, and not necessarily by adding labels like wine or beer to it, although if you do insist upon doing so, we very, very much want to stress that it is more akin to a beer than it is a wine, even if you don't like that. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.